To talk about it all is House Republican Whip Steve Scalise. Representative, we'll talk in just a second about Afghanistan, but first the news on the passage of this. I'm just going to read you a brief sentence from a letter that these moderate, so-called mod squad, the moderate Democrats, wrote in the Washington Post only 2 days ago. They said, "We are firmly opposed to holding the president's infrastructure legislation hostage to reconciliation, risking its passage and the bipartisan support behind it." How does that square with what just happened?
Well, David, I think what you saw is tremendous pressure placed by Speaker Pelosi on those liberal Democrats who were in moderate districts, and they caved, and they really didn't get anything out of it. They just voted to pass on a party line vote a bill that allows another $16 trillion of debt. That's right, not just the $3.5 trillion tax and spend bill that President Biden was working the phones, pressuring those Democrats to vote for today, but also additional debt, over a 100-page bill that was passed today, a budget that very few Democrats read because Speaker Pelosi rewrote the thing last night. You harken back to the days of her saying you have to pass the bill to find out what's in it. Well, they just got threatened. Last night, a lot of threats were being thrown around by Speaker Pelosi.
Let me just stop you there.
It's a really horrible vote.
Forgive me. Let me just stop you. What form did these threats take? I mean, aren't these representatives accountable to their constituents rather than to the Speaker?
Yeah, you heard her threatening to go and run people against them in their primaries or to use redistricting. And I don't know if she controls redistricting in some of those states, but threatening to redistrict people out of their own districts. Yeah. That's the kind of stuff we were hearing last night. It was disgraceful. That's what it took for her to give the president the ability to spend another $3.5 trillion of taxes and spending when inflation's already out of control. I'll tell you, David, the most disgraceful thing is that at a time when you've got thousands of Americans abandoned overseas behind enemy lines because of President Biden's failure in Afghanistan, he should have been working the phones. He said in 7 days he's cutting and running. That's what President Biden said. You would think every single day he'd be on the phones saving Americans who he left behind enemy lines. He was working the phones yesterday, pressuring Democrats to vote for his tax and spend package. That's what President Biden was doing last night, not working to save those Americans who he abandoned in Afghanistan. It's disgraceful. There are a lot of things that he's done that have been complete failures. The way he's left Americans behind enemy lines is maybe the worst.
I would agree with that, although what's happening on the border is of particular concern to at least a couple of these moderate Democrats that finally caved to Nancy Pelosi. I think of Henry Cuellar. Henry Cuellar has stood out as one of the few Democrats to really oppose the standards for what's happening at the border, and yet hidden in this $3.5 trillion or whatever it's going to be bill is $107 billion for essentially giving green cards to immigrants who will jump ahead of all of the immigrants who've been trying to do so legally. How does Henry Cuellar explain that to his Texas constituents?
Look, I respect Henry. I respect a number of the members on their side. But frankly, when you see a vote, all party line, where every Democrat voted for another $3.5 trillion of taxes and spending and an authorization to add $16 trillion more dollars in debt on the backs of our children, that's no longer a moderate. You're either a liberal or a socialist in their party right now. Now, there are a lot of them that are in swing districts, but they're not voting like anything other than a socialist right now.
Congressman, you look at the polls, because of what's happened in Afghanistan, the president has taken a huge hit. Only 41% approve of what the president is doing. 55% right now disapprove of what the president is doing. I'm just wondering if those kind of numbers aren't going to scare enough Democrats, perhaps not in the House since they caved, but maybe in the Senate, people like Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema. I mean, they clearly are aware of these numbers and aware of the kickback from Americans about what's happening in Afghanistan. Might that stall this bill before it becomes law?
Well, look, all I know is right now there are a lot of Democrats who are disgusted with what President Biden did, just as we are on the Republican side. Because, first of all, I've got a lot of my colleagues who served in Afghanistan. I just did a press conference this morning with 10 different members that spoke of Congress who served in Afghanistan. They are furious. They know some of these translators personally. They're hearing stories of people being executed. The Taliban saying that they're going out door to door to try to find some of these people. They've got lists. They've got names. They've got our military equipment, which is another thing we've asked President Biden to give an accounting of. We're hearing reports of over $85 billion of the best technology and military equipment in the world that President Biden just gave to the Taliban. These are terrorists. You're talking about the heels of the 20th anniversary of September 11th. And President Biden not only just gave them a country, but he gave them Blackhawks. He gave them MRAPs. He gave them night vision goggles, artillery. It's unbelievable this happened. It's disgraceful. It's why our allies all around the world are livid, too. This president is an international embarrassment in the way he carried this out.
You know, I have to mention something that happened. It's sort of tangential to these issues, but it happened over the weekend. We had former CIA Director Michael Hayden retweeting out a deeply disturbing picture that showed Trump voters equating them with Taliban. Their Taliban, our Taliban. That's essentially saying that about half of this country are terrorists. What does that say about the CIA, that the former director of the CIA would equate half of America with the Taliban?
Well, first of all, it's very disgraceful and telling of some of the people that were working in the Biden administration, some from the Obama administration. These were some of the people who were trying to stop Donald Trump from getting elected president in 2016 that President Trump talked about. Frankly, some of these people are still advising President Biden. They all ought to resign in disgrace if they had any shame. Unfortunately, I don't think they do. The fact that they can't tell the difference, they don't know what a terrorist is. They just gave terrorists a country. Right. And by the way, that country's right next to Pakistan, who has nuclear weapons. Look at what our enemies around the world must be thinking. What's China thinking when they look at Taiwan right now? What is Russia thinking when they look at Ukraine right now? Does anybody trust that this president's going to stand up to bad guys around the world? And do any of our allies think this president will have their backs, just like he cut and run on them in this conflict?
Steve Scalise, good to see you, Steve. Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it.